Every morning at 5, Owen Hartley pushed a broom through downtown streets, worn boots, municipal vest, coffee, and a paper cup. Nobody gave him a second glance. Diana Caldwell certainly didn't. Not when she stepped over his mop water without apology, not when she laughed at his uniform in front of her entire executive team, not when she called him the janitor like it erased whatever life he'd lived before. She saw a struggling single father scraping by. She never saw the name behind the name. Nobody did. Until the morning the city found out exactly who Owen Hartley was. Stay with the story. The moment Owen's real name hits the boardroom table will change everything you think you know. The city of Carlisle woke up slowly in the hour before sunrise. Streetlights cast long yellow shadows over empty intersections, and the only sound in the financial district was the slow grind of rubber wheels on concrete. Owen Hartley moved through that silence like he belonged to it. He pushed the municipal cart along the edge of the sidewalk in front of Caldwell Tower, the tallest building in downtown, 40 stories of glass and steel with the family name etched in chrome letters above the entrance. He worked the way a man works when he has been doing the same thing long enough that his hands no longer need instructions from his brain. Steady, unhurried, efficient. He wore the standard orange vest, the kind that makes a person invisible in plain sight. His boots were clean but worn at the heel. He carried a paper cup of black coffee and set it on the ledge of a concrete planter every few minutes while he swept, then picked it up again without looking. Nobody coming in or out of the building that morning looked at him directly. Not the security guard who changed shifts at 5:15, not the delivery driver who propped open a service door, not the young associate who walked in at 6:45 with her head tilted toward her phone. Owen swept. The city stirred around him. He was to all of them exactly what he appeared to be. At 8:45, a black car stopped at the curb in front of the building. The driver came around and opened the door before the engine had fully settled. Diana Caldwell stepped out first. Gray suit, structured shoulders, dark glasses she removed and folded into her breast pocket in a single motion. Logan Pierce followed, holding a tablet and speaking in the clipped shorthand of a man reading from a report he had already half memorized. Diana did not break stride as she moved toward the entrance. Logan matched her pace without effort. Near the revolving door, the wheel of Owen's cart sat partially across the edge of the walkway. Diana registered it without acknowledging it. She did not stop, did not speak. She looked in the direction of the cart long enough to recalibrate her path, then walked around it. Owen stepped aside and drew the cart back. She passed without looking at him. Logan had not looked up from the tablet at all. The door revolved behind them and the morning continued. Owen watched the door settle. He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, set the cup back on the planter, and resumed sweeping. Anyone watching him at that moment would have seen nothing remarkable. No reaction in his face, no shift in his posture. Just a man returning to his work. But if someone had stood very close and paid attention, they might have noticed the way his eyes moved to the upper floors of the building before he turned away. Not with longing, not with resentment. More like someone checking a dashboard, confirming that something was still where he had left it. That evening in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, Owen sat at the kitchen table with a laptop open in front of him. The screen showed a financial data table, columns of figures organized by quarter, annotated in small font along the margins. The logo in the upper corner of the document was a simple emblem above the words Vertex Capital Group. His reading glasses were on the table beside him, but he was not using them. He knew the numbers well enough that he did not need to lean in. His phone vibrated twice. A message from Evelyn Marsh, Audit Phase 2 on schedule. Board wants timeline update. He typed back 2 words, not yet, and set the phone face down. He closed the laptop and went to the window that faced the direction of downtown. Somewhere in that arrangement of lit windows and steel frames, the top floor of Caldwell Tower was still glowing. He stood there until he had seen what he needed to see. Then he went to bed. The following week, Caldwell Corp held a commercial space launch event in the plaza outside the tower. It was a modest affair by the company's standards: white tents, a small stage, a cluster of local officials and business partners, and 2 journalists from local papers. Samuel Reeves from the Carlisle Tribune was one of them. He stood near the edge of the gathering with a notebook in his jacket pocket and a recorder in his hand, watching Diana Caldwell work the room with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 2 decades learning exactly how close to stand and how long to hold eye contact. She was good at it. Samuel had covered enough of these events to know the difference between someone performing authority and someone who actually carried it. Diana carried it, or at least she knew how to make it look that way, which amounted to the same thing in his experience. The municipal cleaning crew had been assigned to the plaza in the hours before the event. Owen was among them. By the time the guests arrived, he had been working the perimeter for an hour and a half. During the event itself, he continued at the edges. collecting cups left on a concrete ledge, repositioning a waste bin that had drifted from its original spot. A paper bag tore without warning as he lifted it, and several items fell near the corner of the stage where Diana was mid-sentence with the other reporter. She turned toward the sound, assessed the situation in under 2 seconds, and said at a volume that carried clearly through the small crowd, "Whoever is managing the cleaning team today, can we address this, please? We have international guests arriving in under an hour." Her tone was not angry. It was the tone of someone noting a system's failure, the kind of comment that is more embarrassing for the person it concerns precisely because it does not treat them as someone worth directing the remark toward. Owen crouched and gathered the spilled items without speaking. Samuel, who was standing close enough to see all of it, watched Owen for a moment longer than the situation required. What registered was not the spilled bag. It was what Owen did not do. He did not apologize. He did not look up at Diana. He did not shrink. He gathered the items, resealed the bag, and stood up straight. The absence of the expected gesture, the nod, the sorry, the quick look of embarrassment, landed somewhere in Samuel's journalist instincts and did not fully release. He made a mental note and went back to the interview. But for the rest of that afternoon, even while he was transcribing Diana's comments on zoning variances and projected return timelines, a corner of his attention stayed on that image. A man in a cleaning vest, standing straight in a moment that was designed to make him feel small, and choosing, without apparent effort, not to feel it at all. Samuel had interviewed enough powerful people to recognize that quality, the quality of someone who does not need the room's permission to occupy it. He had just never seen it before on a municipal worker on an outdoor stage at a real estate launch event. He filed the thought away without knowing what to do with it yet. Inside the tower, away from the event, Logan Pierce sat across from Diana in her office that same afternoon the door was closed. He had a printed summary in front of him, 3 pages, and walked her through it with the measured delivery of someone who had rehearsed how to say a difficult thing in the most neutral possible way. The substance was this. Caldwell Corp filed quarterly financial reports to its primary investor, a fund identified in all internal documentation only as VCG Holdings. The reporting structure required full disclosure of major capital movements. Logan had identified a way to route a portion of project costs through an intermediary entity, which would allow them to retain a margin of revenue without including it in the standard disclosure. He presented it as a cost management strategy. He did not call it what it was. Diana listened to the end without interrupting. Then she was silent for 5 full seconds, not the silence of someone who had not understood, but of someone who had understood completely and was deciding how to proceed. She said, "Do it correctly, no trail." Logan gathered his papers and went to work that afternoon. He was efficient and careful. The way a person is careful when they believe the primary risk is being caught, and not when they believe the primary risk is having been wrong. The distinction mattered. Caution of the first kind is about coverage. It does not account for the possibility that someone with a deeper map of the terrain has already charted every path you think you are taking in secret. The transaction would eventually leave a trace. It always did. That was the thing Logan did not fully account for. The system he was circumventing had been designed by someone who understood exactly how people tried to circumvent it, because that someone had spent a decade building compliance frameworks before he put on an orange vest and started watching things from street level. A few days later, Owen was working near the lobby corridor when a group of international guests arrived early for a private meeting. The elevator bank was 15 feet from where he stood with his cart. The doors opened. Owen stepped forward out of habit and held the door with one arm, giving the group space to enter. One of the men nodded at him. Owen nodded back. Simple, ordinary. Except Diana saw it from across the lobby, and what she saw was not the gesture itself but the posture behind it. Owen was standing straight, not sideways, not at the deferential angle she would have expected. He held the door the way a person holds a door for someone they consider an equal. She could not have articulated why that bothered her, and so she processed it as a logistics issue instead. She called the building manager. "I need the cleaning crew out of the main lobby for the next 3 hours. They should not be in the sightline of guests during the meeting." The manager confirmed. Owen received the reassignment on the crew radio and began moving his cart toward the side corridor. Before he turned the corner, he paused and looked back, down the full length of the lobby to where Diana was standing near the reception desk. He held the look for 3 seconds. Not in anger, not in challenge. Just looking. She noticed it the way you notice something you cannot immediately classify. Then he was gone around the corner, and she told herself it was nothing. That evening, Owen sat in his car outside the apartment building and made a call. He spoke for less than 4 minutes. The person on the other end was Evelyn Marsh. He did not mention Diana, the lobby, or any of it. He said only, Move to phase 3. I want everything documented and verifiable within 12 days. Evelyn said she understood. He ended the call and went inside. Samuel Reeves had been working on his financial investigation for 6 weeks before the name VCG Holdings appeared in his notes, with enough frequency to demand its own column. He had started with a narrow question: why were 3 commercial real estate projects in Carlisle's development corridor showing unusual cost structures in their public filings? 1 project might be an accounting variance. 2 was coincidence. 3 was a pattern. The pattern pointed him toward Caldwell Corp., and Caldwell Corp's investor disclosures kept referencing VCG Holdings as a primary stakeholder, but every attempt to find meaningful public information about VCG Holdings produced almost nothing. No leadership profile, no press releases, no investor-facing communications, only an address, a legal registration in Delaware, and the name of a registered agent, Evelyn Marsh. Samuel called the number on record and got an appointment 2 days later. The office was not what he expected. Quiet, small, a conference table, and 2 chairs that had clearly been used a great deal. Evelyn Marsh was in her 40s, well-dressed without being conspicuous, and she spoke to Samuel with the professional courtesy of someone who had spent years giving reporters exactly enough to fill a paragraph and not a word more. She confirmed that VCG Holdings was a legitimate investment entity. She confirmed it had an interest in Carlisle commercial properties. She did not confirm the extent of that interest, did not name any individuals connected to the fund, and offered nothing beyond what was already technically a matter of public record. At one point, Samuel asked directly, "Can you tell me who the principal decision-maker is at VCG Holdings?" Evelyn looked at him with an expression that was entirely pleasant and said, "That information is not something I'm in a position to discuss." It was the most complete non-answer Samuel had received in years of interviewing people who were paid to give non-answers, and it was delivered with such complete absence of discomfort that he understood immediately there was no follow-up question that would open it. Samuel thanked her, collected his recorder, and stood to leave. In the small reception area near the exit, he stopped. A man was sitting in one of the 2 chairs along the wall, orange municipal vest worn at the sleeves, no cart, no equipment, just sitting, elbows on his knees, looking at the distance with the relaxed patience of someone who had been waiting a while and did not mind waiting longer. Samuel recognized him. He could not immediately remember from where, and then he did the plaza event, the cleaning crew, the torn bag. This man. Here. In the office of the registered agent for a major investment fund, sitting in the waiting area like he had a scheduled appointment. Samuel looked at him for a moment too long. Owen did not look back. Samuel walked out. In his car, he wrote 3 words in his notebook: Hartley, find out. Then he drove back to the paper and filed a records request he should have made 2 weeks earlier. Meanwhile, Logan Pierce was moving faster than either his confidence or his judgment warranted. Within 2 weeks of his conversation with Diana, he had executed 2 transfers through the intermediary entity, a shell company registered in Nevada with no public-facing officers. The total sum redirected was just under $800,000, structured to sit below the threshold that would automatically trigger additional disclosure requirements. He believed the math was clean. He believed the trail was closed. He was wrong about both. Evelyn Marsh sent Owen a compressed file on a Thursday evening. He opened it at the kitchen table, glasses on this time, and read through 32 pages of annotated transaction records, time-stamped communications, and contract cross-references. 1 transfer carried Logan's internal approval code. The second carried his direct signature. Owen read to the end, set the papers down, and picked up a mechanical pencil. He circled Logan Pierce's name twice. Then he put the pencil down, took off his glasses, and rubbed the back of his neck. He did not call anyone that night. He went to bed at 10:15. A few days before Evelyn made her move, Diana Caldwell hosted a working lunch in the building's private dining room on the 12th floor. 2 partners from a firm considering a co-investment on a large development on the north side of the city. The conversation was going well. The numbers were solid, the timeline realistic, and Diana was in the particular mode of confidence she settled into when she could see exactly how a deal was going to close. The dining room had a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the exterior plaza. Owen was working down there, moving slowly along the perimeter with his cart. One of the partners glanced out and said, absently, that it must be a difficult job. A member of the dining staff, passing with a water pitcher, said without thinking, "Oh, that's Mr. Hartley. He's been on this route for a few years now. Single father, I think." Diana looked out the window. She looked for a few seconds, then turned back to the table and said lightly to the 2 partners, "I genuinely cannot understand people who settle for that kind of life. But then, it's their choice." The 2 men made the small agreeable sounds that people make when a powerful person says something they privately disagree with but I not consider worth challenging. Nobody at the table thought about it again. Below the window, Owen had not heard any of it. He moved to the next section of the plaza, straightened a bin that had shifted, and continued. That evening he called Evelyn. 12 days, not a day passed, she confirmed. Evelyn Marsh called Logan Pierce's office on a Tuesday morning and described the meeting as a routine check-in between VCG Holdings and a portfolio company, something that happened periodically, nothing unusual. Logan arrived at 12:30 with a folder under his arm and a level of self-assurance that under the circumstances was remarkable. Evelyn met him at the conference table. She did not offer coffee. She placed a thin folder on the table between them, 12 pages, no cover sheet, and opened it without preamble. The first page showed a transaction summary. The second showed the Nevada entity's registration alongside its connection to Caldwell Corp's internal systems. Pages 3 through 7 showed the transfer records, the timestamps, the internal approval codes, and Logan's direct signature on the second transaction. Pages 8 through 12 were a verbatim excerpt of sections 7.3 and 9.1 from the original investment agreement signed in 2019. The clauses that defined exactly which categories of capital movement required full disclosure and what the consequences of non-disclosure were. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She read the relevant passage of Clause 7.3 aloud slowly, the way a teacher reads a rule to a student who has claimed not to know it. Logan's face shifted through several states in roughly 30 seconds, from confusion to the beginning of a counter-argument, to something that looked less like acceptance than like the recognition that there was no argument to be made. He tried anyway. He said these were internal financial management decisions and that VCG Holdings had no standing to treat routine cost allocation as a disclosure breach. Evelyn let him finish. She turned to page 9 and read that section aloud as well. The room was quiet when she finished. Logan said nothing. Evelyn closed the folder. You have 48 hours to decide whether you are going to cooperate with the full audit process or require us to proceed through the formal dispute mechanism. After 48 hours, the decision is no longer yours to make. Logan picked up his folder, stood, and left. He called Diana before he reached the elevator. She picked up on the second ring. Logan told her everything with the particular accuracy of a man who now understood the value of being precise. Silence on Diana's end. Then, who was behind VCG Holdings? Logan said he did not know. Diana said, find out today. He could not. Nobody in his network could answer with certainty. VCG Holdings pointed to Vertex Capital Group, which was structured with enough layers that its ultimate ownership was technically a matter of corporate record but practically invisible without the kind of access Logan did not have and could not get in 48 hours. Diana spent the rest of the day on phone calls that produced exactly this result. The name Owen Hartley appeared in nobody's answer. That evening, Owen Hartley stood in front of the mirror in his apartment. He was not wearing the orange vest. He was wearing a white dress shirt, and he worked a dark tie into a half Windsor with the easy practice of someone who had not forgotten how. He looked at his reflection for a moment, not checking himself, not adjusting anything, just looking. Then he went to the kitchen, drank a glass of water, and left. Diana Caldwell convened an emergency session of Caldwell Corp's senior leadership at 7 the following morning. She was composed in the way that people who have trained themselves to manage pressure are composed, meaning the composure was real but the effort behind it was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. She presented the situation as a regulatory clarification challenge. She called Logan's action a misinterpretation of the agreement's scope and said the legal team would have a response prepared. She spoke for 11 minutes. The room listened with the particular attentiveness that people produce when they are deciding whether to believe what they are being told. The question behind every face around that table was the same. Does she actually have this under control, or is she telling us that she does? The room received her presentation in the careful silence that rooms adopt when they suspect the authority figure is incorrect but do not yet have the information to say so. 15 minutes into the session, the general counsel's assistant slipped through the side door and placed a printed summary in front of the lead attorney. He read it. He said nothing for about 10 seconds, which in a room full of people trained to fill silence was itself notable. Then he spoke. Through 3 layers of holding company structure, VCG Holdings controlled 67% of Caldwell Development Corporation's actual voting shares. Not a minority position, a controlling position. The company they were sitting inside belonged in every meaningful sense to someone else. The room said nothing. Her attorney continued. Under the terms of the original investment agreement, VCG Holdings had the right to call an extraordinary board meeting and propose changes to senior leadership without requiring Diana Caldwell's approval for the vote to proceed. Diana looked at the projection screen for a long time. She said, "Who is behind VCG?" The attorney said they were still working to confirm. Nobody in the room knew the name Owen Hartley, not yet. The meeting dissolved into urgent phone calls. Diana went back to her office and closed the door. She thought about every conversation she had had in the past 3 months with anyone who had mentioned VCG Holdings or anything connected to the fund. She came up with nothing. VCG Holdings was, by design, a presence that explained everything in retrospect and revealed nothing in advance. Samuel Reeves published his piece 2 days later. The headline read, "Caldwell Corp. Who actually controls the city's biggest developer?" The story did not name the individual behind VCG Holdings because Samuel did not have the name yet. But what it had was precise. The ownership structure, the 3 layers of holding companies, the disclosure gap that Logan's transactions had created, and the implication, carefully worded but unmistakable, that Caldwell Development Corp's independence was considerably more limited than its CEO had ever publicly acknowledged. By 9 the following morning, 2 of Caldwell Corp's international partners had requested written clarification. By 11, a regional bank in late-stage negotiations on a credit facility issued a brief statement saying it was reviewing the matter. By afternoon, the board of a subsidiary Caldwell Corp had publicly listed was asking questions that Diana's public relations team was not equipped to answer. She issued a statement confirming transparency and cooperation with all legitimate inquiries. Inside the building, the people who worked for her understood that the situation was moving faster than the company's ability to manage it, and that the name at the center of that situation was one nobody had yet identified. The city of Carlisle was asking. The city did not yet know who to ask about. The meeting was called for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning. The formal notification came through Caldwell Corp's legal team the previous afternoon, a request for an extraordinary board session at Caldwell Tower initiated by VCG Holdings, citing Clause 11.2 of the shareholder agreement. The location was specified, Conference Room B on the 28th floor. Diana's team had 42 minutes of genuine discussion about whether to legally contest the request before the attorneys confirmed there were no grounds to do so. The meeting was going to happen. Diana arrived at 8:45. She had chosen carefully, not the gray suit, the darker one, the one she wore when she needed to project stability rather than momentum. The conference table on the 28th floor seated 16. She positioned her team on one side, her general counsel, 2 attorneys, her head of investor relations. The other side of the table was empty, the room was quiet, the building below hummed with ordinary Thursday morning activity. At 5 minutes past 10, the elevator arrived at 28. Evelyn Marsh came through the door first. Diana recognized her immediately, the registered agent, the face behind VCG Holdings in every public record available. Diana's expression did not change. She was prepared for Evelyn. She was not prepared for the person who followed her through the door. He was wearing a charcoal suit, no tie, clean white shirt. He moved without any of the physical markers that powerful people sometimes perform. No deliberate pace, no commanding entry, none of that. He walked into the room the way a person walks into a room they are comfortable in, and pulled out the chair at the head of the far end of the table with the ordinary ease of someone who had sat down at conference tables for 20 years. He looked across the length of the room at Diana. And Diana's mind did something it had not done in a very long time, which was to fail, briefly, to produce an appropriate response to what it was seeing. The face was familiar, she knew that face. She could not immediately place it in this context because the context was wrong, because the context was impossible, because the suit was wrong and the room was wrong, and the face was Owen Hartley's face. Evelyn spoke. "This is Owen Hartley, co-founder and executive chairman of Vertex Capital Group, parent company of VCG Holdings and, through that structure, the controlling shareholder of Caldwell Development Corporation." The room was completely silent, not the working silence of people preparing to speak. The silence of people who have heard something they are still processing. Logan Pierce, seated 2 chairs from Diana, was looking at the surface of the conference table. He did not look up. Diana looked at Owen. Owen looked at Diana. She remembered then where she had seen that look before. Down the long marble hallway of this building 3 weeks earlier, before the man in the orange vest turned the corner with his cart. She remembered it clearly. She remembered the 2 seconds in which she had registered it and classified it as nothing. The understanding of what it actually was arrived in her now without warning, and it did not arrive gently. Owen opened the folder in front of him. It was thin, perhaps 10 pages. He placed one hand flat on the table and said, 3 items. First, the transactions that violated clauses 7.3 and 9.1 of the 2019 investment agreement. Second, the consequences those violations trigger under the agreement. Third, the options that Vertex Capital is prepared to offer Caldwell Corp within the next 72 hours. He paused. "I'll take questions after each section." His voice was level. Not cold, not performative. Simply clear, the way something is clear when the person saying it has no reason to embellish and no need to minimize. He began to read. He spent 12 minutes on the first section. He did not editorialize. He cited timestamps, clause numbers, transfer amounts written in full as they appeared in the document. He did not perform the presentation. There was no pause for effect, no moment where he let a damning figure hang in the air longer than it needed to. He moved from point to point the way an experienced engineer walks through a structural report. This is what the data shows. This is what it means. This is the next item. The absence of theatrics was, in its own way, more unsettling than theatrics would have been. There was nothing to push back against. When he finished, he looked up and waited. Diana's lead attorney spoke first, attempting to raise the question of whether the transactions met the technical threshold for a disclosure-triggering event. Owen turned to the exact page and indicated the relevant line. The threshold is 40% of project-level capital movement. The total moved across both transactions represents 61%. This is not a gray area. The attorney made a note on his legal pad and did not speak again during that section. Diana said, "Mr. Hartley, I think if we step back from the formalities." Owen set his pen on the table. He did not interrupt her. He looked at her and waited. She realized somewhere in the middle of the sentence that she did not have a destination for it. She did not know what came after the comma. She stopped. Owen waited 2 more seconds to be certain she was done. Then he picked up his pen and moved to Section 2. Section 2 covered the remedies available to Vertex Capital under the agreement, including the extraordinary board session currently taking place, the right to nominate a replacement for any executive position in the company, and the right to appoint an independent auditor to review the preceding 3 fiscal years of Caldwell Corp's financials. He listed these not as threats but as provisions. They were in the agreement. They had been in the agreement since 2019. Everyone in the room had agreed to them, in writing at that time. Section 3 was brief. Vertex Capital was offering Caldwell Corp 2 options: full cooperation with a third-party audit process which would be followed by a restructuring of the executive team, or a formal dispute process that would proceed through the agreement's arbitration mechanism and take, at minimum, 14 months. Owen said Vertex Capital's preference was the first option because it was faster and less expensive for the company, which Vertex Capital still owned and had an interest in seeing remain viable. He said it without irony. He meant it practically. He closed the folder. Final questions. There were none. Diana's attorney asked for a recess to confer with his client. Owen said of course. He and Evelyn moved to the windows and spoke quietly together for 22 minutes, while Diana and her team occupied the far corner in a conversation that was, on at least 2 levels, nothing like what any of them had prepared for. The decision that came out of Diana's side by end of day was cooperation. Logan Pierce made his own decision faster. He contacted Evelyn Marsh's office directly the following morning and offered full documentation of every transaction in exchange for the removal of his name from the formal complaint. He was dismissed within the week and faced a civil filing from Vertex Capital that was settled, under terms of confidentiality, 4 months later. Diana Caldwell sat in the CEO's chair of Caldwell Development Corporation for 2 more weeks after that Thursday. There was paperwork to manage, a transition plan to sign off on, and the administrative business of ending a tenure that had lasted 11 years. She carried all of it out with the same efficiency she had brought to everything else, because she didn't know how to do things any other way, and because efficiency at that point was the only form of dignity available to her. The extraordinary board meeting convened 14 days later in the same room. 9 members. 7 voted in favor of accepting Vertex Capital's proposed restructuring, which included a change of senior leadership. Diana was not present for the vote count. By the time the result was announced, she had already begun removing her personal effects from the 28th floor office. She did it over 2 mornings, early, before most of the staff arrived. On the second morning, she crossed the lobby of the building that still bore her family's name above the entrance and walked past the glass exterior wall. Through it, she could see the plaza. A cleaning crew was working the perimeter. 2 people, orange vests, a cart. Owen Hartley was not among them. He was no longer on any crew list, but the carts were the same ones and the vests were the same color, and Diana looked through the glass for a moment with an expression that no one passing her that morning could have identified, and then she walked through the front door and got into her car. Samuel Reeves wrote the second article 9 days after the board vote. This one had Owen Hartley's full name in the headline. It told the story completely. The investment structure, the audit, the board session, the controlled unraveling of a company whose CEO had not known who she actually worked for. Samuel had spent 4 days on the reporting, talking to 6 people who had been in or adjacent to the 28th floor meeting and who were now, with varying degrees of willingness, prepared to describe what had happened in that room. What emerged from those conversations was not the story of a confrontation. It was the story of a procedure, a man walking into a room with a thin folder and 12 pages and dismantling, calmly and completely, a structure that had taken years to build. Nobody Samuel spoke to used the word revenge. Several of them used the word inevitable, which was a different thing. The detail that generated the most response from people who read the piece was not the financial complexity, which was considerable, but the simpler fact. Owen Hartley had spent a portion of most workday mornings for several months as part of the municipal maintenance crew assigned to the building his company controlled, observing the operation from the outside while the internal audit ran on a parallel track. Samuel had requested an interview. Owen declined through Evelyn with a brief written statement. It read, "What I did in the mornings is my own business. As for the rest of it, people have already seen how it turned out." The Tribune ran the quote as a subheadline. Whether it was humility or something else entirely, the city argued about for a while and never conclusively settled. Several weeks later, Owen Hartley left the apartment on the east side on a Saturday morning with no particular schedule. He walked downtown, not the crew route, just the public sidewalks. He was wearing ordinary clothes, a dark jacket, running shoes he had owned for 3 years. No one recognized him immediately, and the few who thought they did were not certain enough to say anything. He walked through the financial district at a pace that was not leisurely and not rushed. He stopped at the corner of Meridian and Fifth, the specific corner where he had parked his cart on the first morning, months earlier, when the city was still dark and the only sound was rubber wheels on pavement and the distant mechanical hum of the tower above him. He stood at that corner for a little while. The Saturday morning crowd moved around him without interest, people with coffee, people with their attention directed toward their own destinations. A man in an ordinary jacket, standing on a corner, watching a city go about its business. The story that Carlyle had been telling about Owen Hartley in the weeks since the Tribune piece was mostly correct in its facts and entirely wrong in its interpretation. People said he had been hiding. People said it was a long game, a calculated piece of theater. They imagined he had stood on that corner every morning savoring what he knew, and they did not. None of that was accurate. He had been working. He had been watching a system he was responsible for and wanted to understand firsthand. He had found what he was looking for and done what needed to be done. That was the whole of it. The rest, the contrast between the vest and the suit, between the broom and the boardroom table, that was something other people needed to make sense of because it said something to them that they were still working out. The story they told themselves was about disguise and revelation, about a powerful man hiding behind a humble costume and then throwing off the mask. But that was not quite it. The mask theory requires there to be two different people, the real one and the performance. Owen Hartley had not been performing either time. He had been exactly himself on the sidewalk with a broom, and exactly himself at the end of a conference table with a folder. For Owen, it was not a contradiction that required resolving. He had been the same person in both rooms. That was the point. That had always been the point. He took his hands out of his pockets and continued walking. The city moved on around him in its ordinary Saturday way, indifferent, alive, going about its business. The corner he left behind looked exactly like every other corner in downtown Carlisle. A traffic light, a crosswalk, a building on each side reflecting the morning light back at itself. Nothing remarkable in any direction, the kind of place where, if you were watching carefully, you might see something, and if you were not, you would walk straight past it without ever knowing what you had missed.